Smoke stopped rising from Sarah Jenkins's chimney 3 weeks into the worst Montana blizzard in a century. Frost crept up her windows like a creeping paralysis. To the valley, the isolated widow was already a frozen corpse, but beneath the snowdrifts, a hidden inferno was quietly keeping her alive. Winter in the Bitterroot Valley does not announce itself. It simply arrives, dropping like a heavy iron shroud over the Montana landscape. By mid-November of 2024, the temperature had already plummeted to a bone-cracking 12 degrees below zero, and the local meteorologists on the crackling AM radio stations were warning of a historic deep freeze, driven by an unrelenting Arctic vortex. For the residents of the valley, survival was a mathematics equation measured in cords of wood. A typical winter required 6 cords. This winter, the locals were frantically hoarding 10, sometimes 12. Chainsaws echoed through the pine forests from dawn until dusk. Driveways became fortresses built from split oak, ash, and Douglas fir, meticulously stacked and bound beneath heavy blue tarps. Thomas Gable, a retired corporate litigator from Chicago who had bought a sprawling 3-story cabin on the ridge, was the proudest of them all. His woodpile was a monument to his wealth and preparation. 15 cords of kiln-dried hardwood delivered by flatbed trucks and stacked by hired hands. He liked to stand on his heated wraparound porch, mug of imported coffee in hand, and survey the valley below. Directly down the slope from Thomas's estate sat a modest, weathered A-frame cabin belonging to Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was 64, a retired high school biology teacher, and a widow of 2 years. Her husband, Arthur Jenkins, had been a quiet, intensely practical man, a structural engineer who spent his weekends tinkering in the dirt. When Arthur died suddenly of a massive coronary out by the mailbox, the entire town of Hamilton assumed Sarah would sell the property and move to an assisted living condominium in Missoula. She did not. She stayed out on the ridge, entirely alone, 5 miles from the nearest paved road. As the historic cold front bore down, Thomas Gable found himself staring down at Sarah's property with growing, morbid fascination. There was something profoundly wrong with her yard. It was completely bare. There were no wood racks. There were no tarps flapping in the bitter wind. There was not a single log, split or unsplit, resting against the cedar siding of her home. The only structure in her yard was an old, rusted tractor and a peculiar, flat concrete pad near the tree line that everyone assumed was the foundation for a greenhouse Arthur had never gotten around to building. "She's lost her mind," Thomas declared one afternoon at Caldwell's general store, stamping his snow-caked boots on the hardwood floor. He leaned over the counter, speaking loudly to Richard Caldwell, the store owner, and Brenda Miller, a local real estate agent who thrived on valley gossip. "I drove past the Jenkins place yesterday. Not a stick of firewood on the property. Nothing. I looked with my binoculars." Brenda clutched her insulated thermos, shaking her head. "Grief does terrible things to the mind, Thomas. I tried to call her last week to see if she needed me to pick up groceries. She told me she had everything she needed and hung up. I think she's given up." "Given up? She's going to freeze to death," Thomas said, a mix of indignation and self-righteousness coloring his voice. "The propane trucks can't get up the ridge anymore because of the drifts. If you don't have a wood stove burning 24/7, your pipes will burst and you'll be dead in your sleep. Should we call the county sheriff?" "And tell them what?" Richard asked, wiping down the register. "That it's illegal to not have a woodpile? Sarah isn't breaking any laws. She's a grown woman." "She's burning her furniture," Thomas insisted, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That has to be it. She's too proud to ask for help, so she's chopping up her dining room table to survive." Down in the A-frame cabin, Sarah Jenkins was not chopping up her dining room table. She was sitting in her favorite armchair, reading a worn paperback copy of a spy thriller, wearing a light cotton sweater and comfortable slacks. The ambient temperature in her living room was a balmy, consistent 72 degrees. She paused her reading, looking out the frost-framed window, just in time to see Thomas Gable's heavy luxury SUV crawling along the distant ridge road, no doubt spying on her again. A small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. She reached over to her side table, poured herself another cup of Earl Grey tea from a steaming porcelain teapot, and took a slow sip. Let them talk, she thought. Arthur had always been a man of secrets, a man who believed that true security was invisible. "The elements are brutal, Sarah," he used to tell her, his hands calloused and permanently stained with soil. "If you fight the winter on the surface, you'll lose. The wind will steal your heat, the snow will rot your wood, and the ice will break your back. You have to go beneath." For the first 5 years they lived in the valley, Sarah hadn't fully understood what Arthur was building out back. He had rented an excavator, digging a massive 12-foot-deep trench behind the cabin, pouring concrete walls that were 2 feet thick. He had spent thousands of dollars on industrial ventilation pipes, heavy-duty moisture barriers, and custom steel hatches. When the neighbors asked, Arthur just smiled and said he was building a root cellar for Sarah's winter squashes. It was the ultimate deception. As the evening light faded, the temperature outside plummeted to -18. The wind began to howl, violently shaking the heavy pines surrounding the property. Sarah closed her book. It was time to feed the beast. She walked past her unlit, purely decorative living room fireplace, stepped into a walk-in pantry, and pulled back a heavy rug. Beneath it was a reinforced steel trapdoor. Unlocking it with a heavy deadbolt, she descended a flight of steep wooden stairs into the earth, leaving the howling Montana blizzard far behind. By the first week of February, the bitter cold transformed into a catastrophic weather event. The National Weather Service dubbed it the Valentine's Day Whiteout. A massive, low-pressure system stalled directly over the Bitterroot Mountains, dumping 4 feet of snow in 48 hours, accompanied by sustained winds of 50 miles per hour. The valley was paralyzed. The main power grid, strained by thousands of space heaters and overworked furnaces, failed catastrophically on a Tuesday night. Darkness swallowed the mountains. Suddenly, those massive wood piles the neighbors had so proudly built became matters of life and death. But nature, as it often does, found the flaws in their preparation. The 50-mile-per-hour winds shredded the heavy blue tarps protecting the wood. Blinding, sideways snow drove itself deep into the stacks of split logs. When the snow briefly melted from the ambient heat of the houses and then rapidly refroze, it encased the firewood in thick, impenetrable layers of solid ice. Up on the ridge, Thomas Gable was fighting a losing battle. He stood in his lavish living room, shivering violently in his expensive down parka. The grand stone fireplace, the centerpiece of his home, was sputtering. The wood he had brought inside was wet, hissing and popping as the trapped moisture boiled off, producing thick, acrid smoke, but practically no heat. His breath plumed in the air of his own kitchen. The temperature inside his house had dropped to 40 degrees and was steadily falling. He cursed loudly, kicking a half-frozen log on the hearth. He had 15 cords of wood, and he couldn't get a fire hot enough to boil a pot of water. A mile away, Brenda Miller was in an even worse situation. The pipes in her guest bathroom had burst during the night, sending a torrent of water through her hallway that had instantly turned into a dangerous skating rink. She was huddled under 4 blankets with her golden retriever, weeping out of sheer frustration and fear. By the 3rd morning of the blackout, The storm broke, leaving behind a terrifying absolute silence and a temperature of -28 degrees. Thomas, desperate to get warm and needing to find dry kindling, strapped on a pair of aluminum snowshoes. He planned to hike down to the main road to see if the snowplows had made it through. As he began his slow, agonizing descent down the ridge, his eyes darted toward Sarah Jenkins' property. He stopped dead in his tracks. The A-frame cabin was completely buried. Snow drifted all the way up to the second-story eaves. But that wasn't what made Thomas's heart drop into his stomach. There was no smoke coming from Sarah's chimney. Not a wisp. Not a trace. Against the crystal-clear, freezing blue sky, the chimney stood as cold and dead as a tombstone. A wave of profound guilt washed over Thomas. For months, he had mocked the old widow. He had gossiped about her at the hardware store. He had assumed she was just crazy, burning her furniture. But now, seeing the lifeless chimney in sub-zero temperatures, the harsh reality hit him. A woman in her 60s, entirely alone, with no firewood, during a total grid failure. She wasn't crazy. She was dead. Panic overriding his own freezing extremities, Thomas abandoned his trek to the main road. He turned and began trudging through the chest-high drifts toward Sarah's cabin. The snowshoes kept him from sinking entirely, but the effort was agonizing. His lungs burned with the icy air. Halfway there, he spotted a figure approaching from the opposite direction. It was Richard Caldwell, the store owner, riding a heavily modified, tracked snowmobile, dragging a rescue sled behind it. Richard cut the engine as he reached Thomas. "The power company says it'll be 5 days before they get the lines up," Richard shouted over the ringing silence of the frozen valley, his face wrapped in a thick wool balaclava. "I'm checking on the outlying properties. Have you seen Sarah?" "Richard, look," Thomas said, pointing a trembling, gloved finger toward the A-frame. "There's no smoke. There hasn't been any smoke for days, and she had no wood. None." Richard's eyes narrowed behind his ski goggles. "Get on the sled." Thomas awkwardly climbed onto the plastic rescue sled. Richard gunned the snowmobile, plowing violently through the drifts, forcing their way into Sarah's front yard. They parked near the buried porch. The silence around the cabin was absolute, deafening. "Sarah!" Richard yelled, his voice swallowed instantly by the vast expanse of snow. They waded up to the front door. Frost coated the inside of the glass panes. Thomas pounded heavily on the heavy oak door. "Sarah! Mrs. Jenkins! Are you in there?" No answer. "We have to break a window," Thomas said, his voice cracking with panic. "She might be hypothermic. She might be unresponsive." "Hold on, don't break the glass yet. You'll let whatever heat is left out," Richard cautioned. "Let's check the back. Maybe we can see into the kitchen." They pushed their way around the side of the cabin, the snow waist-deep. As they rounded the corner toward the backyard, Thomas's snowshoe caught on something hard and metallic, hidden beneath the powder. He pitched forward, face-planting into a freezing drift. Spitting snow, Thomas scrambled to his knees. He looked down at what had tripped him. It was a heavy industrial steel pipe, about 10 inches in diameter, protruding from the earth like a periscope. Its opening was curved downward to prevent snow from entering, and the metal was completely free of frost. In fact, the snow around the base of the pipe had melted away in a perfect 3-foot circle, exposing the dead winter grass beneath. Thomas took off his glove and reached out, hovering his hand over the mouth of the pipe. "Richard," Thomas whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Feel this." Richard stepped over, taking off his heavy mitten, and placed his hand near the pipe. A steady, powerful stream of warm, incredibly dry air was venting out from the earth. It smelled faintly, very faintly, of perfectly cured, burning oak. "What in the world?" Richard muttered. They followed the melted snow trail backward, away from the house and toward the tree line, toward the flat concrete pad that everyone had assumed was a failed greenhouse foundation. As they got closer, they realized it wasn't a foundation at all. The earth had been hollowed out. Set into a heavily reinforced concrete retaining wall, built into the side of a small hill, was a massive, commercial-grade steel storm door. The snow on the door was entirely melted. The air radiating from the structure was warm. Thomas exchanged a bewildered look with Richard. He stepped up to the heavy steel door, grasped the latch, and pulled. The door swung outward on perfectly greased hinges. Immediately, a blast of hot, dry, 80-degree air hit them in the face, carrying the rich, comforting scent of an aggressively hot fire. They stood at the threshold, staring down into a brightly lit, cavernous underground bunker. It was larger than a 2-car garage. The walls were lined with heavy thermal insulation and corrugated steel. And there, stacked with the terrifying precision of a military armory, were easily 20 cords of firewood. But it wasn't just stored wood. The entire underground room was a massive, passive solar and geothermal drying kiln. Heavy-duty dehumidifiers, powered by a humongous off-grid battery bank tucked in the corner, kept the ambient humidity at near zero. The wood was bone-dry, free of ice, snow, and sap. In the center of the subterranean room sat an enormous, cast-iron masonry heater, a specialized high-efficiency European wood stove designed to burn wood so completely and at such extreme temperatures that it produced almost no visible smoke, only heat and a faint heat shimmer. The stove was currently roaring, radiating an immense, comforting warmth that was being channeled through insulated ductwork straight into the basement of Sarah's cabin above. "Close the door. You're letting the draft in," a sharp voice echoed from the back of the bunker. Thomas and Richard jumped. Emerging from behind a perfectly organized stack of cherry wood was Sarah Jenkins. She was wearing a light denim shirt, gardening gloves, and carrying a small canvas tote bag filled with kindling. She looked perfectly healthy, impeccably warm, and highly annoyed. "Sarah?" Thomas choked out, his teeth still chattering from his own freezing house. We thought you were dead. You didn't have any wood in your yard." Sarah walked up the concrete steps, pausing a few feet below the two freezing men. She looked at Thomas's blue lips and shivering frame, then at Richard's snow-covered gear. "Wood left in the yard gets wet, Thomas," Sarah said simply, her tone devoid of malice, but filled with an undeniable, quiet authority. "Wet wood rots. Wet wood freezes. Arthur didn't build this place to survive the winter. He built it to ignore it." She looked at the two men, their grand preparations rendered entirely useless by the storm, standing outside her hidden sanctuary. "Now," Sarah sighed, stepping back to hold the heavy steel door open wider. "Are you two going to stand out there, freezing to death? Or are you coming inside for a cup of coffee?" Thomas Gable stepped across the steel threshold and felt his knees nearly buckle. The transition from a lethal, -28-degree whiteout to a bone-dry, 80-degree room was a physical shock. His frozen joints throbbed in protest as the ambient heat immediately began to melt the thick crust of ice on his parka. Richard Caldwell followed closely behind, pulling the heavy storm door shut. The click of the steel latch sealing them inside cut off the howling wind entirely, leaving only the low, powerful roar of the draft pulling through the massive masonry heater in the center of the room. Sarah Jenkins didn't gloat. She simply pointed to a wooden bench near the battery bank. "Take your boots off before the snow melts completely, or you'll be walking around in wet socks all day. Hang your coats on those iron hooks by the dehumidifier." Thomas fumbled with his frozen laces, his fingers stiff and clumsy. He looked around the underground shed, his previous arrogance entirely replaced by a profound, humbling awe. The space was an engineering marvel. The walls were lined with thick, reflective vapor barriers, ensuring the Earth's natural dampness never penetrated the room. A massive, off-grid lithium battery array sat quietly in the corner, wired to a row of solar panels that Arthur had cleverly disguised as the roof of the old tractor shed above ground. The batteries powered heavy-duty fans that circulated the hot air from the stove through a labyrinth of insulated ductwork, pushing it directly up into the floorboards of the A-frame cabin. But the masterpiece was the wood itself. While Thomas's 15 cords of expensive hardwood were currently entombed in impenetrable ice up on the ridge, Sarah's logs were stacked in pristine, breathable rows. The constant, dry heat of the room baked the moisture out of the wood long before it ever touched a flame. When Sarah tossed a small piece of split cherry into the firebox, it ignited instantly, burning with a furious, clean intensity that produced almost zero smoke, hence the dead, lifeless chimney above. Arthur called it his thermal battery, Sarah said quietly, handing Thomas and Richard each a steaming mug of black coffee poured from a percolator resting on the edge of the stove. He knew that burning wet, freezing wood was a losing battle. You spend half your energy just boiling the water out of the log before it can give you any heat. So, he built this kiln. We bring the wood down here in September. By January, it burns like paper. Thomas gripped the mug, letting the ceramic burn his numb palms. He stared at his boots, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. "Sarah, I owe you a massive apology. I saw your empty yard. I told everyone at the store you were losing your mind. I told them you were burning your furniture." Sarah took a sip of her tea, her expression unreadable. "People in this valley like to put their survival on display, Thomas. They build their wood piles right by the road so everyone can see how prepared they are." Arthur was a quiet man. He believed that if you have to show off your armor, you're already vulnerable. Richard cleared his throat, the ice melting from his beard and dripping onto his flannel shirt. "Sarah, this setup is incredible, but we have a massive problem up top. The grid is completely dead. The substation transformer on Route 93 blew out under the snow load. Power won't be back for almost a week." Sarah's brow furrowed. "A week? In this freeze?" "Yes," Richard said, his voice dropping into a grim register. "Thomas's wood is frozen solid. He can't get a fire hot enough to keep his house above 40 degrees. Brenda Miller's pipes burst last night. Her house is a skating rink. The Henderson family down in the dip. They have a newborn, and they only rely on electric baseboard heaters. I was heading out to check on them when I ran into Thomas." The comforting roar of the masonry heater suddenly felt stark against the reality of the dying valley above them. Thomas looked up, desperation cracking his usually composed corporate demeanor. "Sarah, they're going to freeze. We can't get the snowplows up here. We can't get the propane trucks. The helicopters can't fly in this wind. People are going to die in their living rooms." Sarah looked at the walls of perfectly dry, stacked wood. She looked at the massive iron stove, capable of heating a space 3 times the size of her cabin. She was a widow who valued her privacy, who had tolerated the whispers and gossip of her neighbors with silent dignity. She had every right to lock the steel door and ride out the storm in peace. She set her teacup down on the workbench. "Richard," Sarah said, her voice turning crisp and authoritative, the voice of a veteran high school teacher taking charge of a chaotic classroom. "How much weight can that tracked snowmobile of yours pull?" "With the rescue sled? Maybe 400 pounds, Richard replied, standing up straighter. "Good. Thomas, your hands are thawing. Put your boots back on. There are heavy wool blankets in the storage trunk behind you, Sarah commanded, already moving toward the back of the bunker to gather medical supplies. Richard, you go get Brenda first. She's the closest and the most panicked. Bring her dog, too. Thomas, you're going to stay here and learn how to feed this stove properly. We're going to need to crank the output to maximum. If we're bringing the ridge down here, we need it hot. The next 48 hours became known among the locals as the Bitterroot airlift, though it happened entirely on the ground. Richard Caldwell pushed his modified snowmobile to the absolute breaking point. The storm had broken, but the residual wind whipped the loose snow into blinding whiteouts, dropping the wind chill to a lethal -40. His first trip brought a weeping, severely hypothermic Brenda Miller down the ridge. When Richard carried her through the heavy steel doors of the bunker, she collapsed onto a cot, shaking violently as the 80-degree air hit her frozen skin. Her golden retriever curled up instantly beneath the radiant heat of the stove, refusing to move. Thomas Gable, stripped of his expensive parka and sweating in a t-shirt, took over as the bunker's quartermaster. The wealthy retired litigator hauled heavy loads of dry ash and oak, feeding the voracious masonry heater under Sarah's strict instructions. Every time he opened the cast-iron door, the blinding orange light of the fire illuminated his exhausted, soot-stained face. He had never worked so hard in his life, and he had never felt so useful. By nightfall of the second day, the underground shed had transformed into a crowded triage center. 14 people and 3 dogs were camped in the subterranean room and the basement of the A-frame above. The Henderson family arrived just as the sun set, clutching their heavily bundled newborn. Sarah immediately cleared a space nearest the radiant brick wall for the mother and child, bringing them hot broth and dry clothes. The atmosphere in the bunker was surreal. Outside, the valley was locked in a deadly, silent freeze that was destroying millions of dollars of property. Inside, bathed in the amber glow of the fire and the hum of the battery fans, the neighbors sat on folding chairs and cots, sharing food they had salvaged from their freezing kitchens. There was a profound sense of leveling. Thomas Gable's millions in the bank and 15 cords of wet wood meant absolutely nothing. Brenda Miller's local social status was irrelevant. The only currency that mattered in the subterranean room was dry wood and radiant heat, and it was entirely controlled by the quiet widow they had all underestimated. "I don't know how we'll ever repay you, Sarah," Brenda whispered late on the third night. The bunker was quiet, save for the rhythmic breathing of sleeping neighbors and the steady draw of the fire. Brenda was wrapped in a quilt, holding a cup of hot water. "I was so awful. I gossiped about you. I thought you had just given up on life after Arthur passed." Sarah, sitting in her armchair with her paperback novel, didn't look up from the page. "Grief makes you do 2 things, Brenda. It either makes you stop caring about tomorrow, or it makes you prepare for it obsessively. Arthur gave me the tools to prepare. I just kept the fire burning." Thomas, sitting on a log near the stove with a heavy iron poker in his hand, looked at Sarah. "He was a genius, Sarah. This whole system, it's perfect." "It's not perfect, Thomas," Sarah smiled faintly, finally looking up. "It's just hidden. People spend so much time fighting the surface elements, trying to prove they can withstand the storm. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is just step out of the wind entirely." 5 days after the blackout began, the heavy thrum of a power company helicopter broke the silence over the ridge. Hours later, the distant hum of the Route 93 substation transformer echoed through the valley. One by one, the neighbors emerged from the subterranean shed, squinting against the harsh glare of the sun on the snow. They returned to homes with burst pipes, ruined drywall, and dead houseplants. They faced weeks of expensive repairs. But they were alive. Thomas Gable was the last to leave. He stood at the threshold of the steel door, looking back at the glowing masonry heater, then up at the buried A-frame cabin. He turned to Sarah, extending a soot-stained, calloused hand. "I'm burning those blue tarps when I get home," Thomas said, with a tired, genuine smile. "And next summer, I'm renting an excavator." Sarah shook his hand firmly. "Make sure you dig beneath the frost line, Thomas, and remember to cure the oak for at least a year." The Valentine's Day. Whiteout forever changed the Bitterroot Ridge. The massive tarpaulin-covered woodpiles that once symbolized wealth and preparedness were recognized for what they truly were: vulnerable monuments to human ego. True resilience, as Arthur Jenkins knew, wasn't about fighting the mountain storms on the surface. It was about quietly digging deep, keeping your powder dry, and building a hidden fire strong enough to save your neighbors